In this last session of Module 6, we turn our attention to Paul's writings in the Pastoral Epistles, which are the books of 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. These three books are grouped together for several reasons. First, these books are letters written to leaders of churches, people we call pastors. The term pastor in the New Testament is different from our concept today. A pastor of the New Testament church was a regular participant and part of the church. The determining factor of a pastor's qualification was based on his spiritual maturity and knowledge of Scripture. The leaders or pastors of these churches did not lead their church as a job, but had their own occupations and served their church as well. Today, a pastor is often a professional role, focused more on preaching and church administration. Second, besides being written to church leaders, these letters are also grouped together because they address things we might call pastoral concerns, or issues concerned with leading a church. Third, the letters are grouped together because of Paul's pastoral attitude toward Timothy and Titus. Paul had developed a special mentoring relationship with these two young leaders, and these three letters reflect that attitude. While 1 and 2 Timothy touch on several issues, there are two that seem to stand out. First, Paul answers the question about who should lead the church and what qualifies a person for church leadership. Different churches and Christian movements have debated what the proper offices or roles in the church actually are. They have also argued about who should hold those offices or play those roles. In fact, the church as a whole has debated this for centuries. In this session, we will look at the characteristics that Paul gives the church and will not focus on the debate of church office names. In your reading, Paul speaks first about bishops, or overseers. It seems that these were the senior positions of leadership. Because of biblical requirements, bishops were expected to be upright individuals in their personal and professional relationships and mature in their faith. Paul also pointed to a second level of leadership, deacons, which was an office created by the apostles in the book of Acts. Deacons helped with day-to-day activities of the church, while apostles focused on teaching and leading the church overall. The requirements for deacons were not as high as they were for bishops. It also seems that deacons could have been newer in their faith. Notice that in your reading, neither the bishops nor deacons were selected simply because of their knowledge, because of how well connected they were to society, or because of their wealth. Their spiritual maturity and walk with God was the central qualification. The second thing these books address are teachings within the church. In 1 Timothy chapters 4 and 6, Paul warns Timothy over and over about false teachers and counsels him on what is taught in the church. Paul describes the false teachers as using the gospel to deceive others for selfish gain. He also points out their false teachings, which are binding and burdensome, not at all similar to the liberating message of Christ. In contrast, Paul tells Timothy to focus his teachings on what he learned about Christ from the apostles. If a teaching or idea is distorted or strays away from the teachings of Christ, it should be rejected. Paul's final words are powerful when the setting of 2 Timothy is fully understood. When writing the book of Philippians, Paul thinks he is about to be executed. Instead, he is eventually released and actually travels and spreads the gospel even further. Paul is eventually imprisoned again, and this time he is sure he will soon be executed for his faith. Paul takes a moment to write a letter to Timothy, a young Christian leader who has become like a son to him. It is from this letter that we get the book of 2 Timothy. Paul's final words in 2 Timothy chapter 1 encourage Timothy not to be ashamed. Apparently, as Paul becomes an outcast for his faith, many friends turn their back on him. In an atmosphere of persecution, Paul could have easily grown ashamed of his faith. But instead, Paul encourages Timothy to do the opposite and show total commitment. Because Christ has died and has empowered Timothy, he can stand tall and not be ashamed of his beliefs. This is why Onesiphorus is praised and lifted up as an example to Timothy. In Paul's dark last days, while others turned away in shame, Onesiphorus supported Paul by proudly continuing their relationship. Just as Paul faces a difficult challenge, he knows that Timothy will face one as well. That is why Paul also encourages endurance in Timothy. Paul encourages Timothy not to be ashamed, but to embrace his persecution. A person is more likely to endure if they are proud of what they are suffering for. In trying to encourage Timothy to endure, Paul uses the examples of a soldier, an athlete, and a farmer in 2 Timothy chapter 2. The soldier has a clear purpose of what he wants to achieve. Likewise, Timothy must have a clear sense of what he is struggling for. The athlete, in pushing himself to win the race, must follow the rules if he wants to win a prize. As we live out our faith, we must do so according to the expectations set by Christ. The farmer does not simply throw seeds on the ground and yield a large harvest. The full bins of grain come only after the farmer prepares and cares for the plant. In all of these instances, Paul says we do not endure in our faith simply by chance or coincidence. The person who endures has a clear plan with intentionality and purpose. The end of 2 Timothy contains some of the most powerful words in the New Testament. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, Paul lets us know that his time of death is at hand. Even with his execution so near, Paul looks back at his service to God and is able to accept his death. We should be reminded of the book of Philippians and why Paul is content in such a dire situation. Paul was unsure if he was going to live or die, but he was able to face difficult times with joy because he found his identity and tranquility in who Christ was and not in his immediate situation. He knew that if he lived, he would be able to continue to share his faith with others, and if he died, he would be with Christ forever. In this book, Paul remains calm and is able to say, "I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith." Here we should be reminded of Paul's story about the soldier, athlete, and farmer, and their examples of perseverance and purpose in living out their faith. Remember, Paul is not a perfect man. In the book of Romans, Paul struggled with sin, but he overcame that struggle and has since been faithful in his walk with and service to God. It is this sense of accomplishment that allows him to speak such words. Paul makes a powerful statement that God will give a crown not only to him, but to others like him. The type of crown Paul refers to is a special crown that the emperor would have given to an athlete who competed and won in the early Roman Olympic Games. Likewise, Paul says that the emperor of creation will crown him as a victor. You and I can also receive that same crown from Christ if we fight the fight, finish the course, and keep the faith. Now, take a moment to answer the relational questions and apply what you've learned from these books to your life.